It's happened. After so many years and over 200 successes, a SpaceX Falcon 9 booster has failed to land. How could that be? What could have happened? Will this impact upcoming flights? Will Falcon 9 be grounded by the FAA? Spoiler alert, we asked and we got an answer. In this video, we'll be diving into all of that and more to try and figure out what on earth happened last night in the North Atlantic, including something that some of you might have thought of in the back of your mind. Is Falcon 9 reaching its reliability limit? Very early on Wednesday morning, that's August 28, 2024, SpaceX launched the Starlink Group 8-6 mission from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. On board were 21 Starlink satellites, including 13 direct-to-cell Starlinks. It was your typical run-of-the-mill Starlink mission right in the middle of the night that definitely, some of you don't even bother to watch anymore, including me. I was asleep when this happened. This was in fact the 188th Falcon 9 launch dedicated to the Starlink constellation. The only remarkable thing from this mission was the booster itself. This booster, B1062, was flying for a 23rd time, becoming the first booster to fly that many times. The booster has quite a history, having launched pioneering private human spaceflight missions such as Inspiration 4 and Axiom 1. It holds the record as the booster with the fastest turnaround time at approximately 21 days, and although this happened over 2 years ago, it still hasn't been beaten since. It was quite a storied booster. Just like with any Starlink launch, the launch portion for the booster on this mission went as we would have expected. We saw the liftoff of Falcon 9 with a beautiful ascent, then MECO, meaning main engine cutoff, and a successful separation of the second stage. We then saw the entry burn and the booster steering itself towards the drone ship, as we always see on these Starlink missions. But then, at the landing, things went differently. While the landing burn seemed to start just as usual, shortly after touchdown we saw a lot of flames on the drone ship, what appears to be one of the landing leg struts snapping, and then the booster tips over and blows up. That is obviously when the standard operating procedure ends. That's not normal for a Falcon 9 booster. Shortly after the landing anomaly, SpaceX posted a statement on social media saying, quote, "After a successful ascent, Falcon 9's first stage booster tipped over following touchdown on the Shortfall of Gravitas drone ship. Teams are assessing the booster's flight data and status. This was the booster's 23rd launch." So given all of that, what else might have happened? Well, of course, everything we can see from SpaceX's livestream is nowhere near the amount of accurate and precise data that SpaceX engineers have at their disposal when investigating this incident. That being said, it's always interesting to use that very limited data and previous experience to get an idea of where things might have gone wrong. There's multiple things with the booster that if they fail at the right time, the outcome could be very similar to what we've just seen. For the purposes of this analysis, we'll look at these potential points of failure. The center engine fails or underperforms at the end of the landing burn, resulting in a hard landing. A landing leg collapses as the landing happens and causes damage to the booster and subsequent tip over, or the sea is so rough it causes the booster to slam into the drone ship with a higher landing force than planned, which then causes the damage and tip over that we see. Let's first look at the first possibility, which is that the landing burn failed at the end or cut off early. For a telemetry comparison, we're taking a look at the previous Starlink Group 8 mission from the Cape, Starlink Group 8-3, which launched on August 10th. That should give us a good approximation of what the telemetry should have been on today's mission, as the same group launches are usually very similar to each other because they're delivering the same payload to a similar orbit. But why are we looking at the telemetry? Well, if we saw something very out of order there, we would be able to easily tell if the landing burn went askew. Let's trace it all the way back to MECO. For the 8-3 mission, Falcon 9's first stage was travelling at a speed of 8,049 km per hour at 64 km in altitude, whereas for today's mission, these numbers were a tad bit lower, but not by that much, with a speed of 8,016 km per hour and an altitude of 63.7 km. This is pretty much on par with what we'd expect for a mission of this kind. An earlier mission, Starlink Group 8-9, launched in July from Florida and had a lower speed and altitude at MECO than these two missions. In that case though, the rocket was carrying just 20 and not 21 Starlink satellites, so it didn't need as much performance from the first stage. Given this, it's safe to assume that, if there was an underperformance on this mission, it did not happen during the ascent portion, as the two missions hit very similar MECO speeds and altitudes, and one had a nominal landing and the other didn't. A similar thing happens if one compares the speed and altitude before and after the entry burn. While there's some slight differences, these are within the numbers that we've seen for prior booster entries, and at the end of the day, there's always slight differences between Starlink missions, so it doesn't seem like this was another point where a failure may have happened. This means we have to look beyond the entry burn and go straight to the landing burn. One important thing to point out is that the telemetry is always running ahead of the landing video because it takes less time for text data to reach SpaceX Mission Control and then get displayed on the webcast. We don't know how large SpaceX's telemetry packets are, but they'll be smaller than a live video. For example, YouTube recommends for a HD live stream 1.25 megabytes of data per second. The video stream will also have a buffer built up of a few seconds, which means that the video will always be a little bit behind real time in order to make up for any hiccups in the signal. That means that what happens with the telemetry animation is what is about to happen on the video. For example, we can always see the start of the landing burn first on the telemetry, represented as a sudden decrease in the booster speed, followed by the video of said landing burn. So with that note out of the way, let's take a look at that landing burn. If we look at right when the altitude switches to 1 kilometer above the deck, we can even see that today's mission was slower than the previous mission of Group 8. Honestly, at this point, everything seemed quite normal still, but a few seconds later, we finally got our first clue of where it might have gone wrong. Because of the video delay, in order to interpret when the touchdown takes place, we've got to take a look at when the speed makes a jump, since that is when the booster goes from having some landing speed to just stopping on the deck of the drone ship. The prior Group 8 mission had a touchdown speed closer to 10 km per hour, and then we can see it jump down to 2 km per hour as the booster settles on the deck of the drone ship. Going to an even earlier Group 8 mission, we can see a similar touchdown speed, and we even see the speed going back up again before fully going down to 0. This may have been due to the booster bouncing a little bit after landing, as we can then see from the flex on the legs via the video feed. So what does the telemetry for this landing look like? Well, it appears that there's a sudden jump from 30 km per hour to about 10 or 11 km per hour, which could either be an error in the telemetry, or it could indicate that this is the touchdown speed. This is about 3 times faster than we've seen on previous missions. Doing some quick physics, we know that a touchdown speed 3 times higher means an impact energy 9 times stronger. This could explain the collapsing landing leg that we can see here in the background. A hard landing could also break the nozzles, the octaweb structure, and many other pieces of piping that would explain the fire that erupts right after touchdown. We've seen some fires at the business end of Falcon 9 after touchdown before, and it is quite normal as the engines flame out after the end of the landing burn. But I'm sure you can agree with me that this was a whole lot more fire than we've seen on previous landings. Of course, we do not know the design limit of the landing legs, and it could be that this is not even pushing them to their limit, but by the visual evidence, the landing leg failed, so a high speed and high energy load might be the reasonable explanation for that. So this might indicate that the landing burn did not go entirely to plan towards the end, but if so, what could have caused this? This might sound silly, as the obvious answer could be, well, the engine failed. But did it? This booster was quite old. It had flown 22 times before. This was its 23rd mission, and we know from SpaceX that Merlin engines have in fact launched more times than the boosters have, as these can be moved from one airframe to another and fly more than the booster they're installed on. So sure, that seems like the easy answer. An alternative to this could have been that the engine ran out of propellant right at the end of the burn. We've seen an extreme example of this in the early days of Falcon landings with booster B1024. This booster launched a pair of geostationary communications satellites all the way back in 2016 and attempted to land on the drone ship Of Course I Still Love You. However, this booster ran out of propellant when it was several meters off the deck, suddenly dropping straight onto it, breaking the engine section and producing a very sizable flame. Right after that, of course, it toppled over and blew up, just like B1062 did on this landing. What if something like this, instead of happening meters off the deck, just so happens to take place a little bit closer? The impact speed would be lower, there would still be damage to the booster and legs, a fire would break out and the booster would tip over. Sound familiar? Of course, it might seem far-fetched that suddenly a booster might run out of propellant, but remember, SpaceX is still pushing the limits of Falcon 9 reusability, and it could be that they just came to the limits of what boosters can use in terms of propellant consumption. There's also a bunch of other potential explanations to this as well, like, I don't know, a clogged filter in the oxygen inlet that makes the engine underperform, super heavy, and just like that, we can keep going on and on. There's plenty of examples with this and other rockets of how a rocket engine may suddenly underperform. That doesn't need to be associated with wear and tear. Okay, so let's assume that actually the landing speed we just talked about was okay and within the bounds. It could then be that the landing leg just failed. Once again, let's remember this booster was flying for a 23rd time, and while we unfortunately don't know much about whether these landing legs get changed out very often or not, one could attribute this to wear and tear. The landing legs don't just allow the booster to settle on the landing zone, but they also take some of the force of the landing. If these can't sustain the force, they break and the booster topples over. To absorb this impact, the legs use shock absorbers first for low impact landings, and then crush cores that then get used up if the landing is a bit more rough. The tougher the landing, the more the legs get crushed, and therefore the booster gets lower on the deck of the ship. One can imagine that if the legs just completely fail to absorb the booster's landing speed, even if that speed is within the bounds, then the engine nozzle would hit the deck of the drone ship. If they crack, this could make the booster's own kerosene leak out from them and then produce the fire we see, followed by the booster tipping over. The third option on our list is that the drone ship may have just been in rough seas. The booster uses a radar altimeter located at the base of the octaweb in order to precisely know how far it is from the deck of the ship. But if a rogue wave were to hit the ship just as the vehicle came in for landing, then it could raise its deck such that the booster ends up touching down at a higher speed than usual, breaking the engine section and legs and producing the fire and tip over. We were wondering about this ourselves, so we consulted our local boat expert Gavin to take a look at the buoy data and see if the sea state was rough or not. According to data from a buoy 45 miles to the northeast of the landing zone, seas in that location had a significant wave height of 2.6 feet, or about 80 centimeters. That is not really that high and in the normal range for what Falcon 9 can handle, and has handled in the past. Overall, this is more in the calm sea territory for Falcon 9 and not a particularly rough sea state. If we look further at the weather forecast from the 45th Weather Squadron, we can see that they had rated the additional risk criteria of recovery zone weather as low, so this was not really an envelope-pushing mission. So the theory of a high wave, while not impossible, seems rather unlikely at this moment. One interesting thing to point out is that despite everything we just talked about, the booster came down pretty much on a bullseye. Even our own Jack Beil pointed this out when it touched down, only to realise what was about to happen next.
Bingo! Right in the center. Oh!
Oh,
Oh, no!
Oh no!
No, 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 no!
And
We've looked at 3 potential causes for this based on the limited information we have, but maybe we forgot to consider something else, and frankly, there's a lot of other things in play during landing. For example, the radar altimeter could have failed. It happened already once in 2016, and it resulted in the booster using up all of the crush cores on its landing legs. By some sort of miracle, it survived the landing, but it had a noticeable lean when it returned to the port. That booster was then refurbished and flew again as the Falcon Heavy side booster for the Falcon Heavy demo flight, and it is now on display in the Gateway exhibit at the KSC Visitor Complex. Now, after saying all of this, I'm sure you're probably already scrolling to the comments section to point out all of the other potential theories we missed. Good, we like that. Tell us if we've missed something and we'll give it a thought. As I said at the start of the video though, SpaceX has a lot more data than we do, and will investigate this anomaly and hopefully tell us what happened at some point. But the next question remains, what are the implications for upcoming launches? I mean, we have the history-making Polaris Dawn mission coming up soon, a bunch more Starlinks and lots of other customer missions as well. Well, in the short term, it already had an impact on SpaceX's manifest as the Starlink Group 9.5 mission was scrubbed before it could launch. It was planned to launch just a couple of hours after this mission from Vandenberg, but SpaceX released a statement saying, quote, "Standing down from our second Starlink launch of the night to give the team time to review booster landing data from the previous launch. A new target launch date will be shared once available." That makes sense. If you do not know what went wrong, you should probably not launch again and risk losing another booster. Something like this could in theory be applied to Polaris Dawn as well. The mission right now is planned for Friday night, and if SpaceX hasn't reached a conclusion by then, it wouldn't be surprising to hear this delaying further. In any case, it's awaiting acceptable Dragon splashdown weather anyway, so that'll probably take a higher priority in the launch readiness than this incident for now. With Polaris Dawn being a crewed mission, there is of course an additional layer of safety in place, and SpaceX will want to make sure they understand what is going on before flying 4 astronauts into space. But some of you might say, but it's a landing, it does not matter for the safety of the crew. And yes, imaginary YouTube comment, this is in theory correct. However, if the failure is because of the Merlin engine, that engine is also used during ascent, when the crew is, on top of the rocket. SpaceX may want to take some time to confirm that this is something that happened only during this booster's landing, and no other booster has a similar issue. If something is indeed wrong, then it's best to find it now, while Polaris Dawn's booster is still on the pad. In fact, during post-production, we've had comments from both SpaceX VP of Falcon launch vehicles John Edwards and VP of Launch Kiko Donchev. Edwards ended with, quote, "One thing we do know though is that this was purely a recovery issue and posed no threat to the primary mission or public safety," whilst Donchev followed with "Lessons learned from recovery failures will not only improve recovery reliability, but also ascent reliability." If you're familiar with Starship, you may know that sometimes the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, requests operators to stand down from missions when a mishap occurs. We can find on the agency's website how and what it considers a mishap. There's a whole list of 9 points. However, it is not clear whether this landing failure really enters within this ruling or not, and even if it were, would it meet any of these conditions for a mishap? It's not very easy to tell. It is because of this uncertainty that we contacted the FAA right after this anomaly took place. The agency responded back and said, quote, "The FAA is aware an anomaly occurred during the SpaceX Starlink Group 8-6 mission that launched from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida on August 28th. The incident involved the failure of the Falcon 9 booster rocket while landing on a drone ship at sea. No public injuries or public property damage have been reported. The FAA is requiring an investigation." So this clears up any doubts. SpaceX will now need to perform a mishap investigation about this incident and report their findings to the FAA. As we've seen in the past, SpaceX could return to flight if the FAA considers that the public safety was not endangered at any moment by issuing a public safety determination. We've seen this before with Starship flights, and most recently with the launch failure of the Starlink Group 9-3 mission. SpaceX will need to request that safety determination and prove to the FAA that the public was never in any danger. Once the FAA agrees with it, then SpaceX will be able to resume launches. We don't know how long this would take, but last time it was just 2 weeks, so perhaps there won't be a huge impact going forward. Now, one way to look at how SpaceX may act in the future based on this is by looking at what the company did previously. The last time a landing failed was during the Starlink V1.0-19 mission back in February 2021. The booster for that mission, B1059, was flying for a 6th time and was trying to attempt a landing on Of Course I Still Love You. According to the explanation SpaceX provided back then, this booster had a hole in the protective cover that they called the engine boot. During ascent, the exhaust gas normally recirculates up into the engine section, and these boots protect the fiddly bits of the engine from getting damaged on the way up and on the way down during re-entry. But due to that small hole, the engine was damaged and shut down seconds before MECO. Since the booster was not going at the right speed and altitude at MECO, it missed the drone ship altogether. When that happened, SpaceX delayed by a week or so a Starlink mission that it had planned to perform that same month, moving it into early March. Remember, this was when Falcon launches happened every week or two, rather than every 3 or 4 days. During an earlier booster landing failure with B1048, the booster also failed its landing due to an engine failure during ascent, and this also triggered an internal investigation at SpaceX and some delays on other missions as well. So based on previous history, SpaceX is just doing the same thing as it did before, and there are no surprises here. We'll just have to wait and see when they're comfortable enough to fly again, but hopefully it's sooner rather than later. Some of you may also now be thinking, wait a minute, didn't another Falcon 9 fail a launch just a month and a half ago? Is Falcon 9 hitting a reliability limit? Well, yes and no. It may have hit the reliability limit that it has now. As Elon Musk, SpaceX's CEO, explained on social media, quote, "Now we will figure out what went wrong to drive the landing failure rate far above 1 in 1,000, then 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million, etc." That is, it may have hit its current reliability limit, but thanks to this failure and figuring out what went wrong, SpaceX will be able to learn a lot about what to improve on Falcon in order to bring that reliability even higher. It's worth pointing out that this landing failure broke a streak of 267 consecutive successful landings. This is more than the amount of consecutive successful parachute landings for space capsules, for example, and it is higher than the consecutive number of launches of any rocket, except Falcon 9 of course. So in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't look to be such a huge deal. Falcon's reliability both on launch and landing is indisputable. Also, this was an old booster, and it could just be that some wear and tear was behind this anomaly, and they need to improve the longevity of some hardware. Perhaps it's not related to reusability either, maybe it was because of SpaceX's increased launch cadence, or maybe none of the above. At the end of the day, it's hard to tell. So what are your thoughts? Do you think it had to do with any of this, or was this just a one-off event? Let us know what you think in the comments. We'll be back with This Week in Spaceflight on Friday, so make sure to tune in for any updates. I've been Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.